Lauren Silva had always believed that keeping a low profile was the best way to live peacefully. She was not the kind of woman who sought unnecessary attention or engaged in neighborhood politics. Her work as the city's chief building inspector demanded a level of discretion, and she had grown used to being the invisible force that ensured the city's structural integrity remained intact. She preferred it that way. In her years on the job, she had seen it all: corrupt developers trying to push through illegal construction, desperate property owners forging documents, and homeowners attempting to bypass city codes with cheap, unsafe modifications. It had made her cynical but also exceptionally sharp. She had developed an instinct for spotting trouble long before it escalated into a legal disaster, and that instinct had never failed her. So when she moved into her new home, an elegant but aging historic house in what was supposed to be an affluent and respectable neighborhood, she had no intention of drawing attention to herself. The house needed work, but she welcomed the challenge. She had spent years enforcing building codes on others. Now she had the chance to restore something of her own, carefully preserving the architectural details that had originally drawn her to the property. She envisioned a slow, meticulous renovation that would allow her to enjoy every phase of the process, from selecting the right period-appropriate materials to overseeing the skilled labor necessary to bring the home back to its former glory. But from the moment she arrived, it became evident that her new neighbor, Karen Jenkins, had a very different vision for the area. The first interaction had been brief but telling. On the day she moved in, Lauren was unpacking a few essentials when she heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against pavement. She turned to see a well-dressed woman approaching her driveway, carrying a clipboard and an air of quiet authority. "Welcome to the neighborhood," the woman said, her smile polite but not particularly warm. "I'm Karen Jenkins. I live right next door." Lauren nodded, setting down the box she was carrying. "Lauren Silva. Nice to meet you." Karen's gaze shifted past her, lingering on the front of Lauren's house, her mouth tightening slightly as if she had already formed an opinion about the state of the property. "Lovely house," she said after a pause, though the tone suggested the opposite. "It's been sitting empty for quite some time. We were all wondering who would take it on. This street has a very particular look, you see. A lot of us have worked hard to maintain a certain standard." Lauren instantly recognized the subtext. Karen saw herself as the unofficial enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, and Lauren's restoration project was already being evaluated through a critical lens. She had dealt with Karens in her professional life before, women who wielded bureaucratic technicalities like weapons and thrived on making themselves the gatekeepers of how things should be done. She wasn't particularly concerned. "I appreciate that," Lauren said, keeping her voice neutral. "I have a deep respect for historic preservation, so I'll be making sure the house is restored properly." Karen seemed to scrutinize her for a moment, as if trying to determine whether Lauren was someone she could control or needed to deal with. "Well, as long as everything stays within reason," Karen said with a small chuckle. "You'd be surprised how many people move in and start making changes that really don't fit with the rest of the street. You should see what the previous owner tried to do before we—" She caught herself, waving a hand dismissively. "Well, let's just say we're very protective of our community." Lauren simply nodded. She didn't need Karen's approval, nor was she interested in getting into a passive-aggressive battle of property management philosophies. As far as she was concerned, she was here to restore her home, mind her business, and ensure everything was done legally and correctly. If Karen had an issue with that, it was her problem. But of course Karen did have an issue with it. The first sign of trouble came when Lauren noticed Karen's car constantly parked at an awkward angle, partially blocking the sidewalk in front of her house. It was a seemingly small inconvenience, but it quickly became clear that it was intentional. The car's placement forced Lauren to maneuver carefully every time she pulled out of her driveway, and when she walked outside one afternoon and saw Karen standing by her vehicle, watching her with a knowing smirk, Lauren understood Karen was testing boundaries. Then came the comments. They weren't outright hostile. Karen was far too calculated for that, but they were persistent. I've always thought that sidewalk was a little too wide for this street, Karen mused one day, as if making casual conversation. It's such a tight turn getting out of my driveway. I have to be extra careful not to hit it. I keep telling myself one day, I'm just going to take a chunk of it out and make life easier. Lauren gave her a glance but didn't engage. The remarks continued. You know, a lot of newer developments don't even have sidewalks like this. It's just wasted space, really. I was thinking it might make more sense to extend my driveway a bit. Wouldn't that be practical? Lauren didn't bother responding, but she did make a mental note. Karen wasn't just talking, she was planning something. Then, one morning, she heard the sound of heavy machinery right outside her window. Lauren's mind instantly snapped to what it could be. Construction? Roadwork? Maintenance? None of those should have been happening in front of her property. She stepped outside and felt her stomach tighten as she took in the scene. A crew of workers, clad in high-visibility vests, were using jackhammers to tear up the sidewalk. Lauren's sidewalk. Her patience snapped into cold, immediate calculation. She didn't yell. She didn't panic. She walked straight up to the man who looked like the crew lead, her posture steady and commanding. "Who authorized this?" she asked. The man looked up from his clipboard, clearly taken off guard. Mrs. Jenkins, I believe. She said the city had given approval to modify the driveway access. We're just following the work order. Lauren held out her hand. "Show me." The man hesitated but handed over the paperwork. Lauren scanned it quickly. It had an official city seal, but something was wrong. She knew every legitimate city document by heart, and this one had mistakes: the wrong font, an outdated signature format, a misaligned permit number. It was a forgery. Lauren lifted her gaze slowly, her jaw tightening as she handed the document back. "Stop all work. Immediately." The man shifted uneasily. I'd have to check with Mrs. Jenkins." Lauren pulled out her phone and dialed a number without hesitation. "This is Lauren Silva, Chief Building Inspector. I'm reporting unauthorized destruction of city infrastructure. Get a compliance officer out here now." The man blanched. "Wait, you're with the city?" Lauren's eyes were ice cold. "Yes, and you just admitted to destroying municipal property based on falsified authorization." The workers exchanged nervous glances as the sound of jackhammers stopped mid-drill. Karen, standing nearby, realized too late that she had made a very, very big mistake. The air had thickened with an almost tangible tension since the morning the jackhammers hit the concrete. A moment that had instantly shifted Lauren Silva's stance from reserved homeowner to a quietly commanding presence. While the work was immediately halted, and the crew packed up under her direct order, the damage had already been done not just to the sidewalk, but to the relationship between two properties that now stood in a silent standoff. For the average person, perhaps this would have marked the end of the incident, a strange neighborhood anecdote, a one-time overstep. But Lauren knew better. In her professional experience, such actions never came from impulse alone. What Karen had done wasn't a slip-up. It was a test of limits, a probing strike. And people like Karen, people who weaponized social positioning and manipulated perception, never stopped after the first pushback. They simply changed tactics. Lauren filed her initial report the same day, attaching photographic evidence, timestamps, amps, and notes about the falsified permit presented by the work crew. She had the documents scanned and sent to the legal review department at City Hall, initiating a routine but thorough inquiry. She didn't mention Karen by name in the initial paperwork, opting instead to document the facts without editorial. This wasn't about revenge or settling personal disputes, it was about protecting public infrastructure and upholding code. Let the legal department uncover what they needed to uncover. Lauren knew how to respect the boundary between professional and personal, even when provoked. But that boundary, she quickly learned, was not going to be respected from the other side. The following week, she noticed small changes. subtle things that, to an untrained eye, might seem coincidental. A local landscaping crew appeared and trimmed the bushes near Karen's driveway, but they also clipped a portion of Lauren's newly planted hedge. A water utility truck parked in front of her house for over an hour one afternoon, with no crew members exiting, no service calls made, and no explanation left behind. Packages she had been expecting specialized tools and materials for restoration work began arriving opened, resealed hastily with packaging tape that didn't match the original. And then, perhaps most tellingly, an envelope appeared in her mailbox without postage, handwritten and anonymous, containing a single printed form, a complaint summary from the city's citizen input portal. The complaint accused Lauren of performing unauthorized construction without the proper permits and suggested that her renovation was not in line with the character of the neighborhood. Lauren read the document slowly, twice, absorbing not only the contents but the tone, the calculated vagueness, the way it relied on perception rather than fact, the clear attempt to initiate a review without making any direct accusation that could backfire. It was a classic move: stir just enough dust in the air to obscure visibility, force the other side into defensive explanations, reframe the narrative before it fully forms. She responded calmly. She uploaded her building permits to the city portal, attached architectural plans, inspection reports, and her own signed approvals. But as she did it, she could feel the situation mutating. This wasn't just a neighbor-to-neighbor conflict anymore. It was a layered attempt to undermine her professionally, to using procedural noise and targeted ambiguity to question her integrity. She'd seen it happen to others. The anonymous complaints, the slow drip of community whispering, the quiet attempts to bury reputations under paperwork and hearsay. It was always done through suggestion, never accusation, because suggestions didn't require evidence. Lauren didn't panic. Instead, she began preparing a new file, separate from her casework, a personal record of events, names, dates, and anomalies. She logged each suspicious interaction, each unmarked envelope, each shift in routine that appeared orchestrated rather than organic. She didn't confront Karen directly. That would have been impulsive and emotionally satisfying, but strategically foolish. Instead, she began to learn Karen's rhythm: what time she left the house, how often certain visitors arrived, which contractors she spoke with in low tones by the fence line, which city departments she name-dropped at local meetings. There was a pattern, and though Lauren had no interest in surveillance or paranoia, her training had taught her that patterns mattered. Then came the formal letter. This time it wasn't handwritten or anonymous. It was an official notification from the city's Office of Public Access and Property Review. The envelope was stamped, tracked, and printed on heavy stock paper, and it carried the cold weight of bureaucracy. Inside, the letter read as follows: "We have received multiple community inquiries regarding potential encroachment of municipal sidewalk space by the property located at Lauren's address. In response, a preliminary review has been scheduled to assess compliance with city sidewalk clearance and accessibility codes." There it was. The escalation. Lauren stared at the letter, recognizing instantly that it was a result of orchestrated pressure. Karen hadn't stopped at vague complaints. She had managed to get enough voices, or enough manipulated documentation, to trigger an actual site review. The irony was bitter. The city was about to assess her for violating codes that she had helped to write, enforce, and interpret for over a decade. She attended the review meeting without emotion. The assigned officer, a junior staffer named Dale, was clearly uncomfortable when he realized who she was. He stammered through his questions, citing general policy and guidelines while Lauren provided clear, impeccable documentation. Every detail had been filed, recorded, and time-stamped. Her design conformed to accessibility regulations with room to spare. Dale apologized awkwardly, promising a swift closure of the inquiry. But the meeting had never been the point. Karen didn't expect to win. She simply wanted to put Lauren's name into circulation, into city systems, into staff discussions, into digital logs where it didn't belong. Create just enough noise to generate doubt. Create a version of Lauren that others might view as contentious, problematic, or uncooperative. And it worked at least temporarily. Within days, Lauren began receiving delayed responses from city contractors she'd worked with for years. A scheduled delivery of restoration materials was inexplicably rerouted, marked as unauthorized for delivery at current location. An automatic maintenance request she submitted for her streetlight received a rejection due to a pending property status flag. These were not accidents. These were results of subtle tampering data inputs adjusted by someone with enough administrative knowledge to use internal systems as passive-aggressive weapons. Karen had figured out that she couldn't fight Lauren in direct combat. So instead, she was trying to erode her position by treating her like a citizen rather than a city official, stripping away the shield of authority and forcing Lauren to experience the same infuriating, slow-moving, underdocumented chaos that regular people dealt with every day. It was psychological warfare, dressed up in bureaucracy and executed with an unsettling calm. Lauren refused to show weakness, but privately she began tightening her strategy. She reached out not to enforcement departments, but to internal auditing. She contacted a systems analyst she trusted, someone who had worked on the city's property management database during a prior contract, and discreetly asked for a quiet review of access logs. If there were flags on her address, someone had to have placed them there, and access left a trail. She also adjusted her renovation schedule, shifting certain work to external contractors rather than the in-house team she had originally planned to use. She ensured that every transaction was documented, every inspection scheduled through the most formal and visible channels. She began insisting that all deliveries required signed authorizations, and she set up cloud-based backups of every document, photo, and work order associated with the property. Then, one morning, she found the sidewalk chalked. At first glance, it looked like a child's drawing pink and yellow lines forming a kind of hopscotch pattern. But as Lauren looked closer, she realized they weren't random. The chalk outlined a portion of the sidewalk and part of her driveway, marked with arrows, measurements, and notes. One of the notes said, in large looping handwriting, "Original property line?" with a question mark underlined twice. Another read, "Visual obstruction zone." It wasn't graffiti. It was a message, a statement. A dare. Karen was taking this public. Lauren stepped back, the morning sun casting long shadows across the bright lines scrawled onto her concrete. The implication was obvious. This wasn't just about driveways or property lines or permits anymore. This was a campaign. And campaigns had only one purpose: to force surrender through sustained attrition. Lauren had no intention of surrendering. But she now understood what this was. Karen wasn't trying to win a case, she was trying to exhaust Lauren into walking away from it. What Karen didn't realize was that she had chosen the wrong opponent. Because Lauren Silva didn't back down. She documented the chalk markings, photographed them from every angle, and submitted them along with an internal inquiry to code compliance, not as a complaint, but as a formal incident logged for audit purposes. Then she locked her front gate, turned on her security system, and prepared herself. This was no longer just about enforcing the rules. It was about surviving the storm Karen had just begun. It was just past 6 in the morning when Lauren heard the deep, rhythmic rumble of machinery outside her bedroom window. She hadn't been asleep, not really, but the sound cut through her shallow rest like a jolt. There was something about the way it vibrated through the floorboards that set off an internal alarm. It wasn't the municipal street cleaner or a neighbor's delivery truck, nor was it the familiar idle of a landscaper's van. It was low, prolonged, and methodical. Something was happening. By the time she stepped out onto her porch, wrapped in a cotton robe and gripping her phone, the sun was only just beginning to scrape color across the rooftops. But it was enough to illuminate what was already underway at the edge of her property. It was a backhoe. 2 men in reflective gear, and Karen, dressed in an unsettlingly bright shade of coral, arms folded across her chest, issuing instructions like a foreman at a job site. There were no permits, no flags, no markers. No posted notices. Just the metallic claw of a backhoe poised inches from where the sidewalk had already been compromised days prior, and two workers standing over an array of steel reinforcement rods, bags of concrete, and segmented wooden forms designed for pouring new walkways. Lauren felt her pulse rise but forced it back down. She had no intention of making a scene barefoot in a bathrobe. Instead, she returned inside, dressed quickly, and walked out the front door with the presence of someone whose mere posture meant business. Karen spotted her before she reached the curb and offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Morning," she said lightly, as if they were two neighbors simply crossing paths on their morning walks. Lauren didn't respond to the greeting. Instead, she turned directly to the backhoe operator and raised her voice just enough to cut through the engine noise. "Cut your engine now. Do not lift another pound of concrete." The man hesitated, confused, but Karen interjected before he could respond. "Don't worry, I've got it covered. I told him we were adjusting the slope. There's been water pooling here for years. It's a safety hazard. I'm sure you understand." "I'm not speaking to you," Lauren said sharply, stepping past her. She locked eyes with the operator again. "You're operating machinery on private property. If you can't produce a valid work order with the city's seal and registration number, shut it down. Right now." Karen's tone turned brittle. "I've already spoken to public access. They said as long as it's part of a residential improvement, we're fine. I'm doing everyone a favor. I mean, if you're going to restore your house, shouldn't the sidewalk match? I figured it would save time if I handled it. You're welcome, by the way. You had no authorization to begin construction. This isn't your property and you're not qualified to oversee infrastructure work," Lauren said, now taking her phone from her pocket. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is trespassing and property interference. Step aside." Karen's smug composure wavered for a brief moment before hardening. "You're really going to make this ugly, aren't you? I tried to be cooperative. Everyone knows the way this street should look. People appreciate consistency. You, of all people, should understand that." Lauren called the Office of Municipal Compliance and reported the activity with precise language. She stated the property coordinates, identified the equipment on site, and clarified that she was the owner and that no permits had been issued for the work in question. When she ended the call, the operator had already turned off the engine and dismounted, awkward and unsure. The laborers stood in a loose half-circle, waiting for further instruction, their movements hesitant. Karen stood her ground, lips pressed so tightly together they'd nearly disappeared. Lauren didn't say another word. She simply walked back toward her porch and waited, knowing exactly how long it would take for the city's field officer to arrive. 37 minutes later, a city vehicle rolled up the street. When the officer stepped out, a man Lauren recognized from previous professional inspections. His eyes swept across the machinery, the tools, the materials. He took one look at Lauren and nodded silently, understanding the weight behind the situation. He didn't greet Karen. He walked straight to the workers, spoke to them in low tones, then began taking photographs, measurements, and notes. He asked Karen twice for documentation. She failed to provide any. When he handed her the citation paperwork, she refused to sign, instead tossing the pen onto the hood of his truck with a theatrical flare of indignation. Lauren observed the entire exchange from her porch, still silent. She didn't need to gloat. The law in this case had spoken for her, but Karen didn't retreat. What followed in the days after was less visible but far more corrosive. Lauren noticed it first in the conversations she had while passing neighbors. Where once there had been polite nods and casual greetings, now there were lingering stares, faint expressions of uncertainty, a hesitance that hadn't been there before. Someone had been talking. Carefully, deliberately, but talking nonetheless. The tone of her interactions shifted. A neighbor she'd previously chatted with about paint colors now avoided eye contact. Another declined her invitation to review restoration samples for the shared fence. It was a slow turning of the tide, but it was unmistakable. Karen was painting a new narrative, one where Lauren was not the calm, rule-following professional she truly was, but the inflexible authority figure disrupting community spirit with her rigidity. Then the formal letters began. Not from the city this time, but from a privately retained attorney. The first arrived by courier, an official-looking envelope, watermarked and sealed, addressed to Lauren's legal name. Inside was a notice of intent. Karen, it seemed, was preparing to file a civil complaint alleging property encroachment, obstruction of access, and interference with planned community enhancements. The letter was padded with legal jargon but paper-thin in substance. The real goal wasn't to win in court. The goal was pressure. Financial, emotional, psychological. Karen wanted Lauren to spend time and money defending her right to exist. She wanted to drag the situation into a new arena, one where truth was diluted by strategy and reputation could be weaponized. Lauren didn't flinch. She forwarded the letter to her attorney, someone she'd worked with for over a decade on regulatory cases. She also responded through official channels, not with defensiveness, but with counter-documentation maps, surveys, historical plats, city easement records, all cross-referenced and validated. Her file on Karen was growing, and it was becoming robust. Still, the war of attrition deepened. Late one night, Lauren returned home from a site audit to find small reflective cones placed along the perimeter of her front yard. They were the kind used by surveyors and utility contractors, and each was marked with a small flag half buried in the grass. Attached to one of the cones was a plastic bag containing a laminated sheet that read, "Preliminary marking, potential boundary review, independent assessment pending." No agency, no seal, no contact number. It was nothing more than theater. Lauren documented it, removed the flags, and emailed the city's zoning department to confirm no new assessments had been scheduled. They confirmed her suspicion no review had been initiated. The next morning, someone dumped a pile of gravel across the edge of her driveway, enough to create a minor but deliberate obstruction. A note pinned to the gravel read, "Courtesy delivery will finish install tomorrow." No contact information, no supplier logo. Lauren had it hauled away within the hour. 2 days later, someone placed a sign at the sidewalk, "Future Pathway, Community Enhancement Project in Progress." Again, no authorization. Again, Lauren had it removed. It became a daily ritual document, remove, report. Karen never appeared during these incidents, but her handprints were everywhere. The acts were meant to erode, not break, to distract and provoke, to waste Lauren's time, to test her resolve. Lauren responded by tightening every system. She installed motion-activated lighting, adjusted the sensitivity on her security cameras, and began compiling a dossier not for retaliation but for protection. Every anomaly, every fake document, every unregistered delivery, all time-stamped, all cataloged. But she also made a decision that would change the nature of the conflict. She requested a formal internal review not of Karen but of herself. She submitted her own property permits for third-party verification by a separate office with full transparency. She requested that her communications, her work on her own home, her decisions as an inspector be reviewed for ethical adherence. It was not required. It was not prompted. It was self-initiated. The city approved. Lauren knew that when the results came back clean, that Karen's campaign of distortion would begin to unravel. The one thing someone like Karen couldn't fight was verified impartiality, facts confirmed by systems she couldn't control. And Lauren was playing the long game. As autumn crept into the edges of the trees and the sun began casting sharper angles across the neighborhood, the situation simmered, but it did not resolve. The noise Karen created was no longer just audible through drills and rumors. It had become an ambient pressure, a static undercurrent that whispered through every interaction Lauren had within the community. But she never stooped, never shouted, never gave Karen the dramatic confrontation she likely hoped would turn the tide of perception. Lauren understood better than anyone that silence, when chosen deliberately, could be louder than outrage. The escalation had begun, and Karen had pushed first. But it was Lauren who now held the blueprint, and she was just beginning to build her response. Autumn deepened its grip on the neighborhood with subtle authority. The air carried a sharper chill, the kind that made every breath feel closer to winter, and the trees began shedding their leaves in slow resignation. The quiet rustle of foliage became the soundtrack of the street, and yet beneath the seasonal charm, an invisible tension still hung in the space between two neighboring properties, one where preservation met principle, and the other where entitlement met escalation. Lauren Silva had, for the most part, maintained a steady front through everything: the destruction of her sidewalk, the falsified work orders, the mailed threats, and the public attempts to discredit her both as a resident and as a professional. She had responded with precision and self-discipline, never retaliating emotionally, never raising her voice or falling into the reactive traps Karen had so carefully laid. But despite her restraint, despite her methodical preparation, she was beginning to feel the slow creep of weariness. It wasn't fear. Lauren wasn't afraid of Karen. She had dealt with far more dangerous people, far more manipulative figures, and far more powerful positions. What gnawed at her wasn't fear, it was exhaustion. The cumulative drain of constantly defending her own integrity, of having to verify, log, and clarify every single thing she did in her own home, of being forced to preempt a smear campaign that grew more creative by the week. Karen had created a slow siege not through direct confrontation, but through the calculated deployment of plausible disruptions. Fake utility flags, mysterious contractors, unmarked deliveries, silent gossip, things that, on their own, looked like nothing, but together formed a kind of low-grade assault that pressed against Lauren from all sides. And yet, for all the frustration, she kept her composure, because she knew what was coming next. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was overcast but not yet threatening rain. Lauren was on a scheduled inspection across town, reviewing a permit case involving a commercial renovation, when she received an email from the city's internal audit office. The subject line was blunt: status, voluntary review findings. Her stomach tensed as she opened the message, even though she knew there was nothing in it that should surprise her. The report was attached as a PDF, and when she opened it, the findings were as expected: full compliance, no conflict of interest, no irregularities in her property activity, no misuse of authority. The language was dry, formal, but it delivered what she needed: an official, independent conclusion that she had acted within the law in every aspect of her home restoration. No red flags, no ethics violations, no leverage for Karen to twist. Lauren forwarded the report to the legal office that was still monitoring the civil complaint Karen had threatened. She copied the zoning department, public access, and building compliance. She didn't add commentary or emotion. The document spoke for itself. The timing, however, would become crucial. 3 days later, the report began circulating among department heads. Someone Lauren never found out who passed it informally to a senior manager in administrative enforcement, who had been fielding quiet calls from Karen for weeks under the pretense of civic concern. That manager, seeing the report, forwarded it with a single line: "This puts everything to rest. Drop all pending discussion." Lauren knew about it because within hours the follow-up emails stopped. The silent stonewalling she had been facing delayed replies, evasive answers, unusual rejections came to an abrupt halt. Her requests were processed again with normal timelines. Her inspection work was reinstated without hesitation. The data flags Karen had likely pushed for were removed. Her file was restored to neutral. Karen's effort to distort her professional standing had failed. Lauren should have felt relief, and she did momentarily. But the sense of victory was tempered by a deeper understanding Karen wasn't finished. She had just been cornered, and people like Karen didn't respond to cornering with surrender. They responded with desperation. The next move would be reckless. And indeed it was. That Saturday morning, Lauren woke early and brewed coffee. Her house was still calm in its quiet dignity. She stepped outside to check the weather and immediately froze. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene in front of her property. Overnight, someone had installed a large standing board at the edge of the sidewalk, a custom printed sign featuring renderings of what looked like a proposed pedestrian beautification project. The sign was professionally mounted, complete with metal stakes and foam-backed panels. It included maps, proposed pathways, benches, shaded trees, and artistic lighting. At the bottom, in bold lettering, it read, "Community-led initiative, Phase I test site." Beneath it, smaller text read, "Coordinated by Karen Jenkins, resident advisor." There had been no permits, no community meetings, no notifications. It was propaganda dressed as urban planning. Lauren didn't touch the sign. Instead, she began photographing it from every angle. As she worked, a few passers-by slowed their steps, glancing between her and the display. Some nodded, others looked confused, a few smiled awkwardly. The ambiguity of the installation was the point. Karen wanted it to appear as though the neighborhood had come together to make something beautiful, that Lauren was simply the outlier, the one unwilling to participate, the obstacle to progress. Karen emerged onto her own porch an hour later, dressed casually, holding a coffee mug she didn't drink from. She waved across the yard, the kind of wave that's more show than greeting. "Do you like it?" She called out, her tone infuriatingly cheerful. "It's just a mock-up. We're gauging interest. Nothing's final." Lauren said nothing. She uploaded the photos, attached them to a report, and submitted the documentation to city planning as a misuse of public messaging and unauthorized display of municipal signage. The response came quickly this time. The sign would be removed by Monday. But Lauren had already decided she wouldn't wait. That evening, under soft lamplight, she drafted a statement not for the public, not for social media, but for the neighborhood's advisory board. It was a measured, factual explanation of the legal implications of Karen's unauthorized activity, the weaponization of perceived authority, and the dangers of manipulating public-facing installations to mislead residents. She attached her audit report as supporting evidence, included code excerpts, and provided photographs of the mock-up sign in front of her home. She made no accusations. She simply outlined the truth in detail that was impossible to ignore. By Monday afternoon, the sign had been dismantled. Tuesday morning, she received an envelope in her mailbox, hand-delivered, sealed in gold-edged paper. Inside was a letter from the Neighborhood Advisory Board, a formal request inviting her to speak at the next community meeting. The tone was neutral but polite. They wanted her perspective on how urban renewal projects could be approached more responsibly. Karen was not mentioned. Lauren debated accepting. She had never been interested in neighborhood politics or committee positions. But this wasn't about status or influence, it was about reclaiming narrative. If Karen wanted to cast herself as the voice of improvement, Lauren would counter that narrative with facts, calm leadership, and lawful procedure. And so, she accepted. The meeting was held in the local library's community room, a modest space with folding chairs, a lectern, and weak coffee brewing in the back. About 30 residents showed up more than usual. Karen arrived late, took a seat near the middle, and didn't speak. Lauren stood before the group and explained, in clear, accessible terms, how city procedures worked. She didn't scold or boast. She explained why permits mattered, how resident-led initiatives could be valuable but must operate within legal frameworks, and how misinformation could create unnecessary conflict. By the time she was done, the energy in the room had shifted. People asked questions not about her, but about policy, about what they could do to make their block safer, cleaner, more welcoming. Karen sat motionless, no longer the host of the room. Her influence, for the first time, had been eclipsed not by confrontation but by transparency. As the meeting ended, a few residents lingered to speak with Lauren. Others offered to volunteer on proper beautification committees. A couple thanked her for the clarity. And though no one said it directly, Lauren knew what had happened. The narrative had begun to tilt. Karen's grip was slipping, not because she had been shouted down, but because the structure she built her control on confusion, presumption, illusion was beginning to crack under the weight of someone who simply refused to play her game. That night, as Lauren walked back to her house under the dull glow of street lamps and shifting leaves, she felt something she hadn't in weeks. Not victory, but control. She knew the storm wasn't over. But now, finally, she had pushed through its eye and emerged into clarity. And from here, the path forward would no longer belong to Karen. It would belong to the truth. In the aftermath of the community meeting, there was a moment of brief and almost imperceptible shift when things felt like they might finally settle. Not in the sense that the hostility had disappeared, or that Karen Jenkins had suddenly resigned herself to irrelevance, but in the sense that the neighborhood had seen enough. They had listened, questioned, and walked away with something closer to understanding than spectacle. Lauren Silva had delivered clarity without ego, professionalism without condescension, and a command of process that no amount of social manipulation could erase. That night, as she sat in her living room with the house silent around her and a mug of untouched tea on the end table beside her, she let herself feel, for the first time, a quiet sense of balance. She didn't interpret it as victory, she wasn't so naive. But she did allow herself to breathe, to exhale. That night, she slept for 7 uninterrupted hours for the first time in weeks. And the next morning, the retaliation began. She didn't see it immediately. In fact, the first signs were so slight they almost passed as normal fluctuations of city life. Her Wi-Fi became unstable, the cutting out during virtual plan reviews, and sending error messages during permit uploads. The water pressure in her kitchen sink dropped inexplicably, then returned, only to drop again the following day. A contractor she had scheduled to reface a section of masonry canceled last minute with no explanation and no return calls. Small things. Fragmented. Coincidental on the surface. But Lauren had lived through Karen's first wave. She knew this wasn't coincidence. This was pattern. By the end of the week, 2 more contractors had withdrawn from scheduled work, one citing community concerns, the other claiming they were overbooked. A city maintenance crew parked outside her home for 2 consecutive mornings, but never exited their vehicles or performed any visible task. On the 3rd day, one of the workers walked to her front door, knocked once, and handed her a folded memo, pending environmental review. Possible soil compliance check, do not disrupt surface area. There was no date, no department stamp, no name at the bottom. Just a vague threat manufactured to look bureaucratic. Lauren did not react publicly. She took the memo, scanned it, and forwarded it to her contact in environmental oversight, with a note requesting clarification. They responded the same day. No such review existed in the system, and no employee from their department had been assigned to her area. The next day, the maintenance crew didn't return. Then came the call from her department liaison. Soft-spoken, apologetic, but uneasy. He explained that a citizen had filed a formal complaint accusing Lauren of leveraging her position to advance her personal property renovations. The complaint referenced her use of city language during public meetings, her access to non-public planning resources, and her influence over contractors who operate within city contracts. It was a convoluted, paper-thin document, but it was enough to require a formal response. Lauren took it as calmly as she could, but in the hours that followed, her composure cracked in private. She paced her office, reading and rereading the complaint, parsing every sentence, analyzing the phrasing. It wasn't just bureaucratic static anymore, it was a targeted attempt to frame her as an internal liability, a risk to the very department she had served with excellence for over a decade. Karen had escalated. She had moved from disruptive noise to full-on character assassination through procedural subversion. And she wasn't working alone. The language of the complaint was too precise, too tailored. Someone had helped her write it, someone who understood how to twist regulations into barbed accusations. But Lauren knew what to do. She drafted her response with care, attaching comprehensive documentation, her audit report, all correspondence related to her permits, city approvals for materials and contractors, and third-party verification logs. She cited precedent, ethics codes, and prior cases. She included her voluntary review results and offered to submit to another, broader audit if necessary. When she submitted it, she did so without emotion, without commentary. The system would either function properly or reveal its weaknesses, and either outcome would inform her next move. 2 days passed. And then, just before dusk on a Thursday evening, the real message arrived. She heard at first the sound of gravel grinding under tires. It wasn't the familiar low purr of neighborhood cars. This was heavier. Industrial. She looked out her front window and saw a flatbed truck, unmarked, pulling up slowly to the curb in front of her property. Behind it, a smaller vehicle idled, an SUV with heavily tinted windows. 2 men exited the truck's cab, lifted the rear gate, and began offloading equipment: fencing panels, orange mesh, cones, barrels, and a compact generator with attached lighting. There were no logos, no city markings, no visible IDs, just quiet, efficient movement, purposeful. Lauren stepped outside calmly, phone in hand. One of the men looked up. "We've got work to do on the sidewalk," he said. "Won't be long." Lauren's voice didn't rise. "Who sent you?" "A work order," the man replied without elaboration. "You'll get the paperwork in the morning." She took a step forward. "Do not install a single item unless you can produce the order right now." The man shrugged and kept unloading. The second man began placing cones across her curb. The SUV door opened. Karen stepped out. She didn't approach the crew. She didn't speak to Lauren. She simply stood beside the vehicle, arms crossed, chin lifted slightly, her expression composed and unreadable. Lauren's restraint evaporated, not in anger but in purpose. She walked straight to the generator and turned it off. The men protested, but she ignored them. She turned to Karen. "This is illegal," she said. Karen's voice was calm. "You're overreacting. You're trespassing. You've brought unauthorized contractors onto city land adjacent to private property, and you've done so after initiating a false complaint against a public official. I didn't bring anyone. I can't control what happens in the community. You orchestrated this. You don't own the sidewalk." "But I own what's beneath it," Lauren said. "And I have every approval to prove it." Karen's face didn't flinch. "Prove it, then." And there it was. The line. The dare. The mask of community concern dropped, the game unveiled. Karen wasn't trying to win. She was trying to bait Lauren into crossing a line, losing her temper, acting on emotion. Because that was the only thing Karen couldn't replicate: control. But Lauren didn't give her the performance. Instead, she turned, walked back inside, and made a single phone call, not to code enforcement, not to her department, but to the city legal team. Not with an inquiry, but with an official declaration. She was filing for an injunction against unauthorized activity near her property, based on repeated harassment, the falsified municipal documents, and targeted procedural manipulation. It would be backed by evidence. It would carry weight. And once filed, it would trigger an automatic hold on any non-city sanctioned activity within the flag zone, pending investigation. Within an hour, a municipal enforcement vehicle arrived. The crew was ordered to cease work and remove all equipment. They complied. The SUV disappeared. Karen vanished behind her door. Lauren stood on her porch, not triumphant but tired. She had defended herself again, legally, surgically, but the cost was mounting. And she still had no idea how far Karen was willing to go. That night, she triple-checked her locks, because this wasn't a game anymore. It was something else entirely. The air had turned dry, colder than the previous weeks, and still the quiet felt unnatural. Lauren Silva had always appreciated silence, true silence, not the strained stillness that follows confrontation, but lately, her world had been filled with a hollow kind of quiet that vibrated with anticipation, like the breath just before an alarm sounds. It had been 4 days since the unmarked crew tried to stage a phantom construction project in front of her home, and since then, nothing overt had happened. No new signs, no dropped gravel, no late-night utility flags. Karen Jenkins had made herself nearly invisible, not appearing on her porch, not taking her usual morning walks, not driving in or out during her regular hours. The house next door remained lit but closed, and the SUV with its darkened windows hadn't been seen again. The quiet wasn't peace. It was prelude. Lauren's injunction had been processed quickly, expedited through internal city channels thanks to the volume of evidence she submitted. It hadn't just frozen unauthorized work on or near her property, it had triggered a secondary review of complaint history and permit misuse in her district, a procedural audit that could stretch back years. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't even suggested it. But when the legal team saw how many falsified initiatives had been filed using city-adjacent language or citations, they launched the review automatically. That meant anything Karen had submitted, claimed, or informally supported as a resident advisor was now under formal scrutiny. And Lauren knew that wouldn't go unanswered. It was Saturday when the retaliation finally came, and it didn't come through a whisper campaign or a staged city document or some symbolic cone and picket performance. It came with force. She had left the house early that morning to meet a structural engineer about foundation reinforcement for the west-facing wall. The consultation was at a coffee shop across town, an informal meet she preferred to formal reports, and by the time she returned just after noon, something about the street felt wrong. There was no traffic, no ambient neighborhood hum. As she parked her car and stepped out, she noticed it immediately, the sulfurous smell, subtle but unmistakable. She followed it toward her property line, her pace quickening with every step, until she turned the corner and saw the destruction. The section of sidewalk that had been at the center of every conflict was no longer a sidewalk. It had been jackhammered into jagged concrete rubble, with long cracks spidering out toward her driveway. Someone had not just removed it, they had destroyed it with the specific intent to render it unusable, unrepairable. The damage extended into the grass, uprooting part of her irrigation system, severing the cable lines running underground, and exposing bundles of torn wire and pipework. Spray paint marked the edge of the damage, crude arrows and words like obstruction and public fix scrawled in orange and red. Near the heap of shattered concrete was a laminated printout taped to a steel stake. This area has been scheduled for emergency safety reconfiguration. For your protection. RJ Civic Alliance. There was no such alliance. Lauren stood there, the cold wind lifting strands of her hair across her face, her mind already working through the steps she'd need to take: documentation, calls, reporting. But something in her stopped. She crouched beside the destroyed sidewalk, took a slow breath, and let the frustration move through her instead of trying to bury it. This wasn't a message anymore. It was a declaration. Karen had waited until she was gone, hired someone under a false pretense, and had them commit a felony-level act of vandalism, all under the cloak of pseudo-governmental pretense. She wasn't trying to pressure Lauren anymore, she was trying to force her hand, to provoke a visible public reaction that could be filmed, shared, twisted. Karen was no longer playing by rules, not even the broken ones. Lauren stood up, pulled her phone from her coat, and dialed the city police, not the non-emergency line this time, but the direct line to the internal investigation liaison who specialized in municipal fraud and civic impersonation. Her voice didn't shake as she explained the situation. Within 45 minutes, 2 unmarked cars had arrived. One officer began documenting the damage while the other asked for the laminated sign. When he scanned the QR code at the bottom, it led to a blank page. The fake organization was nothing more than a shell, no registry, no filings, no contact information. Whoever set this up had gone to lengths to make it look official, and had likely counted on the illusion lasting long enough to bury responsibility under red tape. But Lauren had already prepared for this. She showed the officers the injunction paperwork, the filed reports, the neighborhood complaint logs, and the timeline of events that outlined Karen's escalating pattern of subversion. She provided the digital history of prior interference, evidence of falsified documents, and the email thread between herself and the city legal team confirming ongoing review of misuse across the district. She had everything. And now, finally, the reaction wasn't just bureaucratic, it was investigative. The officers left with physical evidence in sealed bags, and Lauren was told that a subpoena could be issued as early as Monday for the private contractor used to destroy the sidewalk. If payment could be traced to Karen or someone operating on her behalf, formal charges could be filed: vandalism of municipal infrastructure, impersonation of a civic entity, and conspiracy to defraud city systems. The moment the police left, Lauren called a structural team to assess whether the foundation of her driveway had been compromised. Within hours, their report confirmed that the shockwaves from the destruction had damaged the bordering edge of her front step minor, but enough to require reinforcement and restoration. She submitted the quote to her legal office and requested that it be added to the record of damages related to neighborhood harassment. That night, the neighborhood was restless. She could feel it not in noise, but in its absence. No one asked questions. No one came by. The blinds stayed drawn across the street. The air seemed thinner. At exactly 8:35, a knock came at her door. When she opened it, Karen was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, no coat despite the cold, a look of mock concern painted thin across her features. "That was unfortunate," she said, voice carefully modulated. "I heard something happened outside. I hope it wasn't serious." Lauren didn't reply. Karen's eyes narrowed just slightly. "I know tensions have been high. Sometimes things get misinterpreted. Sometimes it helps to de-escalate before people take things too far." Lauren stepped forward once, crossing the invisible threshold of power between them until they stood nearly eye to eye. "You destroyed city property," she said, her voice low. "You crossed into criminal territory, and you won't talk your way out of this. There are witnesses. There are timelines. There is proof. I gave you every opportunity to walk away. You didn't take it." Karen held her ground, but the false warmth vanished from her expression. "You think they'll do anything to me? I've lived here longer than anyone. You're just someone passing through." Lauren looked her straight in the eyes. "Then I guess you've been here long enough to know how the law works." Karen didn't respond. She turned and walked down the steps, disappearing into the dark without another word. Inside, Lauren closed the door and leaned against it, letting the weight of the moment settle. It wasn't over. It might never be over in the clean, final way some conflicts are resolved. But a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, and the system was no longer blind to it. And for the first time, she no longer felt like she was defending her place in this neighborhood. She had reclaimed it. By the time the final reports were compiled, the leaves had long since fallen, and a brittle frost coated the lawns and rooftops like a quiet warning. The season had shifted, both outside and within the neighborhood, not with ceremony, but with a collective and exhausted settling. People no longer spoke in cautious tones about what was happening between the two properties on the corner. There was no longer a question of narrative. The truth had come out, not in some cinematic courtroom declaration or public spectacle, but through the slow, methodical confirmation of everything Lauren Silva had known since the first time Karen Jenkins stepped onto her property with false civility and veiled entitlement. The story had ended the way most of these things don't, not with a bang, not with revenge, not with vindictive gloating, but with accountability documented, signed, and filed. Karen's undoing came not in the form of handcuffs or public disgrace, but in the cold, unflinching language of legal consequence. The subpoena issued after the destruction of the sidewalk yielded an invoice trail, a third-party contractor booked through an intermediary, traced back through bank records to a consulting account under Karen's name, one she had set up years prior during her brief attempt at community advising. The charges were formalized and filed: willful destruction of municipal infrastructure, fraudulent use of civic language, and obstruction of legal process. The evidence left no room for maneuvering. Her attorney negotiated a plea arrangement in which she admitted to orchestrating the demolition in exchange for a suspended sentence and court-ordered restitution. She was fined a sum that, while not devastating, was publicly recorded and legally binding. The city ruled her ineligible to participate in any planning, advisory, or public-facing residential initiatives indefinitely. She was effectively exiled from the very systems she once manipulated. The restitution covered the full cost of the repairs to Lauren's sidewalk and entry path, including the structural reinforcements required after the jackhammering incident. A third-party team unaffiliated with either household was assigned to oversee and execute the work, monitored by the city's infrastructure office and reviewed by a separate compliance officer. Lauren stayed involved only to the extent that was necessary, no more, no less. She requested no special treatment, no press, and declined all interview requests from the local neighborhood association bulletin. There was nothing to explain. The facts were already in the record. Karen, meanwhile, sold her house before the end of the season. The sale was quiet, unadvertised, and swift. A for sale sign never appeared on her lawn. She left early on a Wednesday morning, a moving truck arriving before sunrise, her SUV pulling away without so much as a wave. She did not say goodbye to anyone, not even those neighbors who once rallied around her during her fabricated campaigns. They had stopped answering her calls the moment the first city report went public. When the false complaint against Lauren had been officially withdrawn and marked as malicious misuse of process, those who had previously entertained Karen's narratives found themselves distancing without ceremony. In the end, Karen left not disgraced but irrelevant, a figure reduced to silence by the same system she once believed she could control. And Lauren remained. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. But she did finally exhale. With the injunction lifted, the remaining repairs completed, and the final statements signed, she took a week off from inspections. Not to travel, not to unwind in some retreat, but to simply exist in her home, uninterrupted and fully present. She walked through each room with a kind of solemn gratitude, touched the woodwork she had preserved with care, listened to the echo of her own steps across floors she had restored with her own money and oversight. The house no longer felt under siege. It felt hers again, fully, quietly, without condition. She received a formal letter from the Office of Ethics and Oversight, stating that her conduct during the ordeal had met the highest standard of municipal responsibility and professional integrity. The department offered her a role on an internal advisory committee for residential compliance reform, a new program aiming to prevent future misuse of city processes for personal harassment. She accepted, not for prestige or advancement, but because it was the logical end of everything that had happened. If her experience could shape better protections for others, then it needed to happen, not out of vengeance, but out of principle. The sidewalk was rebuilt not as it had been, but stronger. The new material matched the original design but included deeper reinforcement, built-in drainage correction, and embedded fiber joints to prevent future cracks. Lauren oversaw none of this directly. She simply watched from her porch, sipping coffee in a heavy knit sweater, occasionally nodding to the crew as they worked. When the final layer was smoothed and cured, the lead contractor walked up the steps to her porch and handed her a clipboard. "All done," he said. "It's solid. Should last decades." Lauren signed the document and nodded once. "Good. Thank you." And that was it. No more signs. No more cones. No more letters slipped into mailboxes. No more anonymous complaints. Just a street like any other, with leaves skittering along the pavement, children riding bicycles past without hesitation, and conversations once again returning to normal holiday lights, grocery prices, early winter forecasts. Lauren eventually walked the length of the sidewalk one evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the rooftops, casting long amber shadows across the ground. She paused near the spot where the laminated RJ Civic Alliance sign had once been staked, and though there was no trace left of the false initiative, she could still remember the exact placement of every arrow, every line of spray paint. The memory didn't sting. It didn't tighten her jaw or draw heat into her chest. It just sat there, acknowledged, like a closed file in a drawer that no longer needed reopening. At the far edge of the new walkway near the curb, a subtle bronze plate had been installed, small, no larger than a pocket notebook, flush with the concrete and unobtrusive to the casual eye. The city had added it during the rebuild, a standard designation for upgraded infrastructure. But upon Lauren's request, the wording had been slightly modified. It read, "This walkway rebuilt under municipal compliance standards. Unauthorized modifications prohibited by law. Nothing more, nothing personal, no names." But it was enough. When she returned to her porch that night, the lights in the neighboring house remained off. The new owners had not yet moved in. The windows were dark, the mailbox empty. A single porch light had been left on a timer, casting a muted glow against the siding. It would soon house a new family, perhaps a couple, perhaps someone alone like she was, but it didn't matter. The war was over. The house would be theirs to live in, not a tool to fight with. Lauren sat down, wrapped herself in a blanket, and let the silence unfold around her. This time it was real, no longer laced with suspicion or hidden threats, just quiet. Honest quiet. And for the first time in months, she didn't listen for footsteps. She didn't check her cameras. She didn't plan her next move. Because there was no next move. It was finished.